In the early hours of April 14th, 1912, a night that would become eternal in human memory, the North Atlantic Ocean stretched in all directions beneath a sky so clear it seemed infinite. The stars hung above the water like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Orion, the Big Dipper, Venus burning brilliant and alone, and the air held that particular quality of extreme cold that makes the world feel crystalline, sharp, perfectly still. There were no storm clouds, no wind to disturb the surface, only the gentle rhythm of waves that had travelled thousands of miles to meet the hull of a ship that had come to own the night completely. The RMS Titanic moved through this darkness at approximately 22.5 knots, its 882-foot length cutting through the Atlantic with the quiet confidence of something that believed itself inviolable. It was the largest moving object ever built by human hands at that moment in history. 46,000 tons of steel and machinery and elegance, and aboard it travelled 1,316 passengers and 892 crew members, a floating city of unprecedented luxury that had departed from Southampton 5 days earlier on its maiden voyage to New York. The ship itself was a marvel that would not be matched again for 20 years. Harland and Wolff, the great shipyard in Belfast where the Titanic was born, had taken 3 years to construct it, from the moment the keel was laid in 1909 to the day of its launch in May of 1911. The very scale of the undertaking had captured the imagination of the entire world. Workers numbering in the thousands had swarmed over the vessel's skeleton as it rose in the shipyard, riveting nearly 3 million rivets by hand, fitting engines so massive that they required their own compartments, installing pipes and wires and plumbing systems that would have made a city proud. The sound of those rivets being hammered day after day must have been deafening, a constant percussion of human determination transforming metal into a vessel of unprecedented size. The first-class accommodations were designed to rival the grand hotels of Europe and America. The smoking room with its mahogany walls and leaded windows, the à la carte restaurant with its French chefs and white tablecloths, the swimming bath with its heated salt water and bright white tiles, the reading room where the afternoon light would filter through windows overlooking the ship's wake and the endless horizon. The Titanic carried with it the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian engineering and aesthetics, a statement in steel about what modern civilization could accomplish. It was a floating monument to human ingenuity and ambition, a ship that seemed to embody the very idea that we had transcended the limitations that had constrained our ancestors. Those aboard on this particular night were experiencing something that would soon become impossible ever again, the first voyage of the greatest ship on earth. The maiden voyage was always the most desired sailing, filled with celebrities, wealthy industrialists, prominent citizens, and important figures from every field imaginable. There were first-class passengers who had travelled the world and seen everything, yet who stood on the Titanic's boat deck and felt moved to silence by what they beheld. There were second-class passengers experiencing a level of comfort that would have been unimaginable in their regular lives. Bright clean cabins with real beds and electric lighting, common rooms with card tables and warm fires. And there were 710 third-class passengers, many of them emigrating to America to begin new lives, crowded below in compartments that were nonetheless far superior to the conditions in which they had been living. The ship represented hope and possibility and human ambition, all wrapped in the confidence that modern engineering had conquered the ocean itself. By the evening of April 14th, the voyage had been remarkably smooth. The Atlantic had been generous, offering calm seas and steady weather. The ship had received ice warnings throughout the day, several wireless messages noting that other vessels had encountered ice fields in the waters ahead. But ice on the Atlantic in April was not unusual, and the Titanic was moving at full speed, maintaining her schedule with precision. The lookouts on watch had been warned to watch carefully for ice, though no one had ordered a reduction in speed. The night was moonless, which would make ice difficult to spot. The temperature had dropped noticeably as the evening progressed, and some passengers had remarked on the unusual cold, seeping through even the Titanic's excellent insulation. In the first-class dining saloon, the orchestra was playing selections from light operas as the last of the evening's diners finished their meals. In the swimming bath below, the water was heated and calm. In the engine room, the massive reciprocating engines hummed with steady rhythm, driving the ship forward through the darkness at full speed. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith, the Titanic's commander and the most senior captain in the White Star Line fleet, was preparing to retire for the night. He was 62 years old and had planned to make this maiden voyage his final command before retirement. At 11:35 p.m, he instructed the watch officers to continue at full speed and told them to alert him immediately if they encountered any ice. Then he left the bridge in the hands of First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller, seasoned men whose judgment Smith trusted implicitly. The officers understood their responsibilities. The ship was running smoothly, the night was cold and clear despite the moonlessness, and the ice warnings were in their minds. Yet nothing about that night suggested any reason for exceptional caution. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments and could stay afloat even if 4 of them were flooded, a safety feature that had earned the ship its reputation for being practically unsinkable. At 11:40 p.m, Frederick Fleet, who had the watch in the crow's nest high above the bow, spoke the words that would echo through history. "Iceberg," he called down to the bridge below, and moments later, more urgently, "Iceberg right ahead." The lookouts had spotted the dark shape of ice against the starlit sky only moments before impact, a distance that could be measured in seconds. First Officer Murdoch immediately rang down the engine stop signal, and then ordered the engines to reverse, a desperate attempt to slow the ship. He also ordered the helm hard to starboard, hoping to turn the bow away from the approaching ice. Everything happened so quickly that the decision Murdoch made, which would be debated for a century afterward, was made in the space of a few seconds with incomplete information and the sound of the iceberg scraping against the ship's starboard side. The collision itself was surprisingly gentle to those aboard who felt it at all. Many passengers never woke. Others felt only a slight jar, a small shudder that might have been caused by a change in the engine speed. Some described it as feeling like the ship had dropped a propeller. Only those standing in open areas on the starboard side felt the impact clearly, a grinding, scraping sound more than a violent blow, ice moving along the metal hull with a terrible patience. But below the waterline, the impact was far more consequential than most aboard realized in those crucial minutes. The iceberg had scraped along the starboard side of the ship's hull, opening a series of compartments to the sea. The damage was not catastrophic to human understanding in that first moment. There was no massive hole, no immediate flood, but the Titanic had struck the ice at an angle, and the iceberg had opened the hull in 6 separate locations across a distance of nearly 300 feet. The water that began flowing into the ship came not in a torrent, but with a kind of inexorable patience, finding its way into compartment after compartment as the ship's forward motion pushed it deeper into the damage. 30 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith stood with Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's designer and the representative of Harland and Wolff aboard the ship, surveying the damage. Andrews had made his way through the bowels of the ship, sloshing through water that was already accumulating in several compartments, reading the water level gauges, taking mental measurements of the disaster unfolding around him. When he returned to speak with Captain Smith, his face told the story before his words did. The ship could stay afloat if no more than 4 compartments were flooded, but the iceberg had ruptured 6. The math was simple and terrible. The Titanic was going to sink. Andrews estimated they had perhaps 2.5 hours, maybe 3. The wireless operators began sending out the distress calls that would become famous. First CQD, the old code, then SOS, the newer signal that would become synonymous with catastrophe. "We have struck an iceberg and sinking by the head," they transmitted into the darkness, hoping that another ship was near enough to help. Though in those early minutes, no one could be certain. The evacuation began slowly, then with increasing urgency. The order was given, women and children first, as was the custom and the law of the sea. But there were not enough lifeboats. The Titanic carried only 14 standard wooden lifeboats and 2 emergency collapsibles, a total capacity of 1,178 people. There were 2,224 souls aboard the ship. At best, only half could be saved. As the reality of the situation crystallized, crew members who had laughed off the impact in the first minutes were now running through the corridors, knocking on cabin doors, urging passengers to abandon their warm beds and comfortable rooms and climb onto deck into the freezing night. Passengers emerged in nightclothes, some carrying valuables they had snatched from their cabins, others carrying nothing but confusion and the first stirrings of fear. The first lifeboat was lowered at 12:45 a.m., only 65 minutes after the collision. It was not full. Crew members did not yet realize the full extent of the disaster, and passengers were reluctant to leave what seemed like a safe, large and stable ship to climb into small boats hung from cables over the dark water far below. The minutes that followed were filled with a particular kind of dignity that human beings sometimes display in the face of the inevitable. The ship's band, their leader Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians, made their way to the boat deck and began to play. The accounts differ on what they played first, but the music continued as the lifeboats were loaded and lowered into the water. First-class passengers, in evening dress or hastily thrown on furs, moved toward the boats with restraint. Second- and third-class passengers pushed upward through the ship's corridors and stairwells, some finding their way to the boat deck, others trapped below as doors were sealed and watertight compartments clanged shut. The wireless operators continued their distress calls, their fingers tapping out Morse code into the darkness, praying that someone was listening. Captain Smith moved through the ship's corridors, ensuring that the evacuation continued in an orderly fashion, even as the bow sank lower and lower into the water. The temperature on deck had dropped to approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the freezing point of fresh water, nearly the same as the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean into which the lifeboats were being lowered. The night sky, which had been so beautiful just hours earlier, now seemed like a vast indifference. Those same stars that had hung over the evening now watching over the catastrophe with the same patient light. Passengers climbing into the lifeboats felt the brutal cold air on their faces, the rocking motion of the small boats as they were lowered on their davits, the awareness that they were descending into a darkness from which the ship itself, that great symbol of human engineering, was already disappearing. Those left aboard watched the lifeboats drift away with their precious cargo. Some men remained on deck by choice, choosing not to fight for a place in a boat, a quiet dignity that came from accepting what could not be changed. Others found themselves with no choice, trapped below in the corridors and cabins as the water rose relentlessly, or simply unable to reach the boat deck before the ship's final moments swept along by the rush of water or the panic of those around them. The lifeboats themselves, which had seemed so terrifyingly small when passengers first climbed into them over the dark rail, now seemed impossibly far away as the survivors pulled at the oars, trying to put distance between themselves and the sinking ship. They could hear the sounds of the Titanic breaking apart, the terrible screeching of steel, the crash of fixtures and fittings as gravity pulled them down through collapsing compartments, and beneath it all, the sound of water, endless and patient and unstoppable. As the water rose inside the Titanic, it climbed steadily from compartment to compartment. The forward compartments filled first, and the bow sank lower and lower until the entire forward section of the ship was pulled beneath the water. The stern, that massive, beautiful construction of steel and wood, rose higher and higher as the bow sank deeper, until the ship was no longer horizontal but nearly vertical, a terrible angle that had never been designed or anticipated. The water climbed toward the engines, toward the boilers, toward the wireless room where the operators continued their transmissions even as the water approached. And then, as the physical forces became too great for the hull to bear, the ship's back broke. The keel, which had been forged and riveted with such care in Belfast, snapped like a piece of bone. The Titanic split into two sections, the bow and stern, and both halves sank independently into the darkness below. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, less than 3 hours after the collision, the Titanic disappeared completely beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The bow section had already sunk. Now the stern section, having risen nearly vertical into the night sky, slipped backward into the water with a kind of horrible finality. The noise that accompanied this moment, the roar of water, the screams of those in the freezing ocean, the sounds of the ship itself giving up its fight against the sea, gradually faded as the Atlantic closed over the wreckage. By the time the sun began to rise, there was nothing visible to show that the greatest ship ever built had been there just hours before. There was only the darkness of the water, and the cold and the lifeboats drifting with their survivors scattered across the ocean, calling out into the night, waiting for dawn. The RMS Carpathia, which had heard the wireless distress calls, was racing through the darkness toward the coordinates transmitted by the Titanic's operators. By dawn, the Carpathia's crew could see the lifeboats, small fragile vessels on the vast ocean, carrying 710 survivors of the 2,224 souls who had been aboard the greatest ship on Earth. The rescue took hours. As the sun rose higher in the sky and illuminated the scene, Passengers from the lifeboats could see the water around them filled with debris, deck chairs, wooden planks, sections of the ship's fixtures, and other remnants of the catastrophe, and they understood with a new clarity the magnitude of what had happened. The Titanic, which had represented human triumph over nature, which had been celebrated as practically unsinkable, which had set out on its maiden voyage just 5 days earlier amid fanfare and optimism, was now a graveyard on the ocean floor, taking with it all the hopes and dreams and lives of those who had gone down with it. The survivors crowded aboard the Carpathia, confused, traumatized, wrapped in blankets and shock, tried to comprehend what had occurred. They had left the Titanic believing they would be rescued quickly, never imagining that the ship itself would be gone. Mothers held children they had managed to save while looking back toward where the ship had been, knowing that fathers and brothers and husbands were gone forever into the darkness. The ocean, which had seemed so beautiful that night under the stars, had become a tomb, dark and deep and endlessly cold. And far below, in absolute blackness at a depth of nearly 12,500 feet, the remains of the Titanic settled onto the sandy bottom of the North Atlantic, where it would remain undiscovered for nearly 73 years. The wreck was lost to time and tide and the impossibility of searching such a vast ocean for such a small target in such deep and hostile water. The Titanic, which had been watched by crowds of thousands as it was constructed and celebrated as the achievement of the age, now lay in the darkness, its story incomplete, its final resting place unknown to the world. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Anyway, back to the Titanic. For 73 years, the Titanic remained a mystery. The ship had sunk on April 15, 1912, disappearing into the darkness with 1,500 souls aboard. And in the decades that followed, no one knew with certainty where on the vast Atlantic Ocean floor its wreckage lay. The radio distress calls had given approximate coordinates, a square of ocean hundreds of miles on each side, a search area larger than some countries, but the ocean is impossibly large, and 12,500 feet down is impossibly deep, a place where the weight of the entire Atlantic Ocean presses down with a force that would crush almost anything. Expeditions had been mounted over the years, particularly in the 1970s and early 1980s, when a businessman named Jack Grimm had funded several attempts to locate the wreck using sonar technology. Grimm had come tantalizingly close in his explorations, finding objects that might have been part of the ship, piecing together clues from the scattered evidence on the ocean floor. But he had never confirmed the Titanic itself, never verified beyond doubt that the great ship lay where the sonar suggested. The technology available then was not quite ready for such a task. Sonar could scan the depths and create rough pictures of what lay below, could show shapes and sizes and suggest what might be present. But in the immensity of the Atlantic, even something as large as the Titanic could be easily missed, could be mistaken for a natural rock formation, or the debris of other wrecks that lay scattered across the bottom. The ocean floor at that depth was an alien landscape, vast plains of sediment stretching endlessly, rocky outcroppings rising like mountains in miniature, valleys and ridges that extended for miles in every direction, canyons that had been carved by currents over millions of years. And somewhere in all of this, somewhere in the crushing darkness that had never known the touch of sunlight, somewhere in the cold that hovered just above freezing, the remains of the ship waited in silence, its story incomplete, its location a mystery. Finding the Titanic would require not just determination, but the right combination of technology, funding, timing, and luck. It would require someone who understood the ocean, who had spent a lifetime learning to navigate its mysteries, and who possessed the obsessive dedication necessary to search for a single wreck in such an enormous space. That person was Robert Ballard, a legendary oceanographer and explorer whose name would become synonymous with deep-sea discovery. Ballard had grown up fascinated by the sea and by the stories of what lay hidden in its depths. He had served in the United States Navy and had developed expertise in underwater exploration and deep-sea technology. By the early 1980s, he had become a leading researcher in oceanography, working at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, one of the world's foremost centers for marine science. Ballard had developed a particular interest in shipwrecks and in using the latest technology, remotely operated vehicles and specially designed cameras to explore the deepest and most remote parts of the ocean. He had explored underwater volcanic vents that supported extraordinary ecosystems, had conducted research into the geology of the ocean floor, and had become convinced that with the right tools and the right approach, the Titanic could be found. But finding the Titanic was expensive, extraordinarily so. Deep-sea exploration required ships, large research vessels capable of operating in the North Atlantic, equipment of extraordinary sophistication, specialized vehicles designed to function at pressures that would instantly crush anything less carefully engineered, and teams of expert technicians and scientists capable of operating this equipment and interpreting the data it provided. Funding for such an expedition would be difficult to secure unless there was a compelling reason, unless there was a government or private entity willing to invest millions of dollars in the search. Here is where Ballard's path intersected with an opportunity that would change everything, that would transform the search from an impossible dream into a realistic possibility. The United States Navy had a secret objective that they wanted accomplished, a mission that they could not reveal to the public, but that was of vital national security interest. Somewhere on the ocean floor near the Titanic's final resting place lay two nuclear submarines that had been lost, the USS Thresher in 1963 and the USS Scorpion in 1968. These submarines represented national security interests, and the Navy wanted detailed information about their condition, wanted to know exactly what had happened to them, wanted to assess what information might be available to foreign powers. The Navy could not announce such a project to the world, could not draw attention to these military vessels and their secrets and their locations. But Ballard understood this world intimately, understood the needs of the Navy and the possibilities of deep-sea exploration, and he saw an elegant solution. The Navy would fund his expedition to find and explore these submarines as a classified project, and in exchange for that work, for successfully locating and documenting these military vessels, Ballard would have the opportunity to search for the Titanic as his reward for successfully completing the military mission. It was an arrangement that allowed both parties to achieve their objectives while maintaining the secrecy the Navy required. The Navy would accomplish its classified objectives, and Ballard would have the resources and the opportunity to pursue the historical discovery that had become his life's work. In the summer of 1985, Ballard assembled a team and set sail aboard a research vessel. The expedition was organized as a joint French-American effort, with French researchers and equipment contributing to the search. The French, in fact, had developed some of the most advanced deep-sea camera technology in the world, and their participation was essential to the project's success. The team brought with them the Argo, a remarkable piece of engineering, a deep-sea camera sled that could be towed behind the ship at depths of up to 20,000 feet. The Argo was essentially a torpedo-shaped vehicle, bristling with cameras and lights, designed to illuminate and photograph the ocean floor as it was slowly dragged through the darkness. The images from the Argo would be transmitted up through a cable to the ship above, where they could be studied and analysed in real time. It was cutting-edge technology for its era, a system that represented the marriage of oceanographic science and advanced engineering. The search began in August in the waters of the North Atlantic where the Titanic was believed to rest. The team knew approximately where to look. They had the distress coordinates transmitted in the early hours of April 15, 1912. They had clues from earlier expeditions that had come close but not succeeded. They had made educated guesses about the currents and drift patterns, and how the wreck might have scattered as the ship broke apart and descended. But even with this guidance, they were searching a vast area of ocean floor, stretching over hundreds of square miles, each square mile looking much like every other square mile, an endless repetition of similar-looking terrain. The ship would move slowly forward through the Atlantic, cutting a path through the water that was as small and insignificant as a single grain of sand moving across a beach, the Argo trailing behind and below like a mechanical creature descending deeper and deeper into darkness. The Argo's cameras would illuminate the grey, sediment-covered landscape in narrow cones of light that revealed only what was immediately below the vehicle, a field of vision so limited that most of the ocean floor remained in darkness, unseen and unknown, waiting in the cold. Days passed, then weeks. The team photographed miles of empty ocean bottom, gentle slopes of sediment that stretched toward horizons they could never see, occasional rocks and boulders that lay dormant on the bottom, the occasional remains of other wrecks, other histories, other stories lying undisturbed in the abyss, other ships that had sunk decades or centuries earlier and had been claimed by the sea. The search was monotonous and hypnotic, a rhythm of constant watching, an endless procession of images flowing back to the ship above, each one studied carefully and analysed before the Argo continued forward, moving into new territory, into spaces that had never been seen by human eyes. Would this mile be the one? Would the next? Would the ship pass right over the wreck without recognising it, miss the target in the vastness of the ocean? Would the technology fail? Would they run out of time or funding? The pressure and repetition of the search began to wear on the team, even as they maintained their focus and discipline, even as they kept their attention fixed on the monitors, on the endless stream of images coming from the deep. And then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1985 at 1:05 in the morning, the Argo's cameras spotted something that broke the monotony forever. On the ocean floor, lying in the sediment, was a boiler, a massive, cylindrical object that could only have come from a large steam-powered ship. But not just any boiler. This was a Scotch boiler, the type that had powered the Titanic. The team looking at the monitors aboard the ship above recognised it immediately. This was it. This was the moment they had been searching for, the moment when nearly 3/4 of a century of mystery and speculation came to an end. The boiler sat on the ocean floor at a depth of 12,500 feet, perfectly preserved by the cold and the darkness and the pressure, its metal surface covered with a fine layer of sediment, but still clearly recognisable as a product of human industry, an artefact that could only have come from the great ship that had sunk in 1912. The silence that fell over the ship when the boiler was spotted was profound. There was no celebration, no cheering, no moment of triumph in the conventional sense. Instead, there was a deep, almost spiritual recognition that they were looking at something sacred, a grave marker, essentially, sitting on the ocean floor. Ballard and his team understood immediately and profoundly that they were not simply looking at an archaeological discovery, or a historical curiosity, or a technological achievement. They were looking at evidence of a catastrophe, at remains that represented the final resting place of over 1,500 people. The Titanic was not a wreck to be plundered or exploited. It was a memorial, a place deserving of respect and reverence. Ballard made a decision in that moment that would become a defining characteristic of his entire exploration of the wreck. He decided that the Titanic would not be treated as a prize to be displayed, or a treasure to be harvested. Instead, it would be treated as the gravesite that it was. The team continued forward cautiously, the Argo moving slowly and carefully over the ocean floor, its cameras now seeking the bow section of the ship itself. And then, as they progressed, the debris field began to appear on the monitors. Objects appeared in the sediment, pieces of the ship's superstructure, recognisable sections of the vessel's construction, fixtures and fittings that had come loose as the ship broke apart and sank. The ocean floor became less uniform, more populated with evidence of the disaster. The Argo moved forward through a landscape that was becoming increasingly distinct and recognisable. This was the path the ship had taken as it fell. And then, rising up out of the sediment, the bow section itself came into view. It was a moment that would be described as awe-inspiring, as shocking, as profoundly moving by everyone aboard the ship who saw it. After nearly 3/4 of a century of being lost, the Titanic was found, its bow rising out of the depths, still upright, still recognisable, still clearly bearing the marks of the ship that had carried 2,224 souls into the night of April 14th, 1912. Ballard made the decision to hold a moment of silence and a memorial service aboard the ship. This was not an expedition that had simply found a wreck. This was an expedition that had discovered a grave, had finally been able to account for the lost, had brought closure to a historical tragedy that had unfolded nearly 3/4 of a century earlier. A flag was raised, the house flag of Harland and Wolff, the shipyard in Belfast where the Titanic had been built, and it was held aloft aboard the ship above as a signal of respect to the wreck far below. The service lasted only a few minutes, but in that brief span of time, the significance of what had been accomplished was acknowledged and honoured. The search for the Titanic was over. The mystery that had lasted since 1912 was solved, and the long sleep of the greatest ship ever built was finally interrupted by human eyes seeing it once more, bearing witness to its final state, honouring the memory of those who had gone down with it. In the days that followed, the Argo continued its careful exploration, photographing the bow section from every angle, documenting the ship's current state, surveying the debris field that extended around it. The team mapped out the layout of the wreck, traced the path of the debris, and photographed individual pieces that had distinctive features and would aid in understanding how the ship had broken apart during its final descent. The images that were transmitted from the Argo to the ship above, and which would eventually be seen by the world, showed a vessel that was remarkably preserved despite its ordeal. The bow was still standing upright, relatively intact, recognisable as the front of a great ship. The railings were still visible, the anchors were still in their hawse holes, the fittings on the deck could be identified. It was as if the Titanic, held in the cold darkness of the deep ocean, had been preserved in a state of suspended animation, protected from the decay and deterioration that would have claimed it, had it sunk in shallow, warmer waters, or had it been exposed to air and light and the organisms of the surface world. The cold at 12,500 feet, the pressure, the darkness, the slow speed of decomposition in such conditions, all of these had conspired to preserve the ship in a state that allowed future generations to see it much as it had looked on the night of April 14, 1912, save only for the encroaching rust and the layers of sediment and the absence of the thousands of lives that had inhabited it. The news of the discovery electrified the world. For decades the Titanic had been a legend, a story passed down through generations, a narrative that was becoming more mythological than historical, as time moved forward and living memory of the ship grew more distant. Documentaries and books and films had kept the memory of the ship alive, had ensured that new generations learned about the tragedy and about the engineering marvel that had been lost, but it had always existed only in photographs and drawings and in the imaginations of those who had heard its story. The Titanic was ancient history, something that belonged to the previous century, something that was known but not seen, that was remembered but not witnessed. And then suddenly the Titanic was real again, present and immediate and visible. Real images from the wreck itself began to be transmitted to the media, to newspapers and magazines and television networks around the world. The bow rising out of the darkness like a ghost from the deep, still upright after all these decades. The debris scattered across the ocean floor in haunting patterns, a trail that told the story of the ship's final moments. The boiler that had first alerted the search team to their discovery, that massive cylindrical object that had once powered the ship and now lay like a monument to human ambition and human loss. These images brought the history of the Titanic into sharp focus, transformed it from a legend into a documented reality, made it immediate and undeniable and powerfully real. People who had never known the ship existed now saw it with their own eyes, saw the evidence of its final moments preserved on the ocean floor, saw the preservation that the cold and darkness had provided. The mystery that had lasted for nearly 3/4 of a century was solved at last, and the world's fascination with the Titanic was reinvigorated with new energy and new intensity. The search had succeeded. The discovery of the Titanic on the ocean floor came to the world first as images. In the weeks and months following that first September morning when the boiler was spotted, a series of photographs and video footage emerged from the Argo's cameras, showing the wreck in its final resting place, showing the ocean floor at a depth of 12,500 feet where no human had ever been, where the pressure was so immense that it would crush almost anything, where the darkness was so complete that there had been no light since the formation of the ocean itself. These images, transmitted through miles of cable from the deep to the ship above through the darkness, travelled further still through the world's media, appearing in magazines and newspapers and on television screens in homes across the planet, in living rooms and offices and schools, transforming the distant and forgotten history of the Titanic into something immediate and present and undeniable. And for the first time in nearly 3/4 of a century, the world saw the Titanic not as it had been, as a great ship floating across the Atlantic, magnificent and powerful and full of life, carrying within it the hopes and dreams of 2,224 souls. But as it was now, resting on the ocean floor in a state that was haunting in its preservation and its emptiness, a testament to both the fragility and the durability of human creations. The bow section rose from the sediment upright and recognisable, a monument to engineering and human hubris, standing like a ghost on the ocean floor. It was damaged, yes, altered by the violence of the sinking and the impact with the ocean bottom, but it was still unmistakably the bow of the Titanic. The anchor chains were still visible. The windlass, the great winch used to raise and lower the anchors, was still in place. The bow railing, made famous by a film that would not be made for another 12 years, was still there, still intact, the metal preserved by the cold and the darkness and the extraordinary conditions of the deep ocean. Looking at the bow section, one could imagine the ship as it had been, could reconstruct in the mind's eye the vessel that had been celebrated across the world, that had carried 2,224 souls into history. But the bow was not the whole story. The Argo's cameras captured image after image of the debris field scattered across the ocean floor, a vast and heartbreaking landscape that told the story of the ship's final moments. The stern section, the aft part of the ship, lay some 600 metres away from the bow, separated from it by a stretch of ocean floor that was covered with debris. The stern was far more damaged than the bow. As the ship sank, the bow section had gone down relatively intact, but the stern, once the ship had broken apart and both halves were sinking, had been caught at a terrible angle, had twisted in the water as it descended, had rotated and contorted until it impacted the ocean floor at such force that it was crushed, compressed, twisted into shapes that were barely recognizable as part of a ship. The stern lay at a different angle than the bow, twisted on its side, a mass of tangled metal and destruction that spoke to the violence and chaos of the ship's final descent. Between the bow and stern sections lay the debris field, a landscape of lost objects scattered across the ocean bottom. As the ship broke apart and sank, as its structure collapsed and gave way, as the hull split and compartments gave way to the water, objects from every part of the ship drifted downward, tumbling through the water for over 12,000 feet, eventually settling on the sediment-covered bottom. The Argo's cameras captured them one by one, each object a small tragedy, a piece of history that had been lost but was now recovered, now visible, now bearing witness to what had happened. There were shoes, pairs of shoes lying on the ocean floor, somehow still holding their shape, still appearing almost as if someone might reach down and pick them up. The leather had been preserved by the cold and the darkness, had resisted the processes of decay that would normally consume such organic materials. But it was the fact that the shoes were in pairs, left shoe and right shoe lying near each other on the bottom, that made them so poignant, that suggested the sudden removal of the people who had been wearing them, the instant separation of person from object that had occurred in those terrible final moments on the Titanic. There were dishes and plates bearing the White Star Line logo, the mark of the company that had built and operated the ship, now sitting on the ocean bottom as if waiting to be collected and washed after a meal that would never come. There were wine bottles, their glass somehow remaining intact despite the crushing pressures and the violent descent. There were a child's marble, now residing permanently in the deep. There were reading glasses, now resting forever on the sea floor. There were coat buttons, tiny objects that must have been torn from their garments as the ship went down. Each object was small, was insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a narrative, told a story of sudden loss and transformation, of the moment when the ordinary became the extraordinary, when everyday objects became artifacts of a historical tragedy. And then there was the extraordinary sight that Ballard's team encountered as they explored the wreck more thoroughly, the rusticles. These were formations of rust that hung from every surface of the wreck, extending downward like amber-coloured icicles, like formations of frozen rust that had grown over the years as bacteria worked on the iron and steel of the ship. The rusticles were created by iron-eating bacteria, specialised organisms that could survive at the extreme depths and temperatures of the ocean floor, that could feed on the rust that formed on the metal of the ship, that left behind these beautiful and terrible formations that made the wreck appear as if it were an ancient ruin, as if it had been sleeping at the bottom of the ocean for millennia rather than for mere decades. The rusticles created a texture and a character to the wreck that was unlike anything that had been anticipated. They draped from the railings, they hung from the superstructure, they created formations that looked almost organic, almost as if the ocean itself were reclaiming the ship, transforming it, turning it into something that belonged more to the ocean than to human history. The rusticles were a reminder that the ocean was alive, was a dynamic and active place, that even at the extreme depths and temperatures life persisted, that the Titanic was not a static monument, but was constantly changing, constantly being altered by the organisms and forces that inhabited the abyss. The grand staircase of the Titanic, that magnificent structure that had been one of the most impressive architectural features of the ship, that had connected the first-class areas and had been the heart of the ship's public spaces, was now an open void. The Argo's cameras looked into the space where the staircase had once risen through the ship's interior, where passengers had descended on their way to the dining saloon, where the ship's architect had created something beautiful and lasting. But the wood of the staircase had decomposed over the decades, had been consumed by marine organisms, had been reduced to nothing by the organisms of the deep. All that remained was the space where it had been, a void in the structure of the ship, a reminder that in the ocean's domain, even the most carefully constructed and beautiful human creations were temporary, were subject to the slow, relentless processes of decay and dissolution. The absence of the staircase was in some ways more powerful than its presence would have been. It spoke to the passage of time, to the way that the ocean and its inhabitants had slowly reclaimed the ship, to the slow victory of nature over human engineering. The crow's nest, the small platform high on the forward mast where Frederick Fleet had been standing when he spotted the iceberg on that cold night in April 1912, where he had cried out, "Iceberg right ahead!" and set in motion the events that would lead to the sinking of the ship and the loss of 1,500 lives, was still there on the wreck, still recognizable, still preserved in the cold darkness. It was a small, unassuming structure, barely noticeable among the larger features of the ship, a simple platform made of iron and steel, nothing elaborate or grand, and yet it was one of the most significant features of the entire wreck, for it was the place where the crucial decision that sealed the ship's fate had been made, or at least where the information that led to that decision had first been perceived. Standing at the crow's nest, Fleet had been able to see farther than anyone else on the ship, had been positioned at the apex of the vessel's height, high above the water, alone in the darkness with only the stars for company, had been the first set of human eyes to perceive the danger that lay in the night, the danger that would come from the water, the danger that was moving toward the ship even as the ship moved toward it at full speed. The crow's nest was a reminder of the fragility of human life at sea, of the isolation and vulnerability of those whose work kept them on the ocean, of the way that a single moment of perception, a single observation made in the darkness, could alter the course of history forever, could determine the fate of 2,224 souls, could create a tragedy that would reverberate through time and would not be fully resolved until 73 years later, when the ship itself was finally seen again. In 1986, a year after the initial discovery, Robert Ballard made a second expedition to the wreck, this time using the submersible Alvin, a small submarine that was capable of descending to the extreme depths where the Titanic rested. Alvin was not a large vehicle. It was perhaps 23 feet long, compact and maneuverable, designed to carry a pilot and 2 observers down to the greatest depths of the ocean. The descent in Alvin was a journey unlike any other, a descent through the layers of the ocean that took 2.5 hours of slow, steady movement downward. For the first few thousand feet there would be light filtering down from above, a faint blue light that gradually grew dimmer and dimmer. But as the depth increased, the light would disappear entirely, and the ocean outside the viewport would become absolutely black, a darkness so complete that it seemed to have physical presence, seemed to press in from all sides. The temperature would drop as the submersible descended, the pressure increasing inexorably, a force that would instantly crush anything less carefully engineered than the Alvin's pressure hull. The silence of the deep ocean is profound and complete, a silence that seems almost malevolent in its totality, a silence that transforms the human consciousness and makes one aware of one's smallness and insignificance in the face of the vast ocean. Slowly, as the Alvin descended toward the wreck, Ballard would begin to see details of the ocean floor itself. The deepest waters of the ocean are home to a remarkable and unique ecosystem, a collection of organisms that have adapted to survive under conditions that would be instantly fatal to most life forms. The pressure at 12,500 feet is approximately 6,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush most metals and ceramics, enough to compress gases to liquids. The temperature hovers just above freezing. There is no light, no photosynthesis, no primary productivity that depends on the sun, yet life persists here, adapted to these extraordinary conditions. There are creatures with minimal metabolisms, moving slowly through the water, creatures that feed on the rain of organic material that drifts down from the surface world above. There are microorganisms, bacteria and archaea that derive their energy not from sunlight, but from chemical reactions with minerals in the water. There are ghost white crabs that have lost the pigmentation that would be necessary in a world with light. There are sea anemones of remarkable beauty and delicacy. There are fish that exist nowhere else on Earth, fish that glow with bioluminescent light in the darkness, fish that seem impossibly adapted to a world that seems impossible to adapt to. And the Titanic had become part of this ecosystem. As the ship rested on the ocean floor as the years and decades passed, the organisms of the deep had colonized its surfaces, had made it their home, had integrated it into the world of the abyss. The rusticles that hung from the railings and superstructure were not just formations of rust. They were structures created by bacteria, structures that were composed of millions upon millions of microorganisms, all working together in a kind of unconscious cooperation to feed on the iron of the ship. The Titanic was no longer simply a human artifact. It had become a living structure, a structure that was inhabited by the organisms of the ocean, that was part of the food web of the deep, that had been transformed by the processes of the ocean into something new, something that belonged to the deep as much as it belonged to human history. The extreme conditions of the deep ocean had, paradoxically, preserved the Titanic in a way that nothing else could have done. Had the ship sunk in shallow water, had it settled in warmer oceans where decay and decomposition happened more rapidly, had it been exposed to sunlight and air and the organisms of the upper ocean, it would have been consumed long ago, would have deteriorated beyond recognition. But at 12,500 feet, in the cold and the darkness and the crushing pressure, the decay processes that would normally dismantle an object as large and complex as a ship had been slowed to an almost imperceptible rate. The cold slowed the metabolic processes of the organisms that would eat the wood and fabric of the ship. The darkness meant that photosynthesis could not begin, that the primary productivity of shallow waters could not establish itself. The pressure and the isolation meant that the Titanic existed in a state of almost perfect preservation, a state that would last for centuries, perhaps for millennia, a state in which future generations could come and see the ship much as it had been, could bear witness to what had happened, could understand in a direct and unmediated way the history of the disaster. When Ballard's submersible finally approached the bow section, and the lights of the Alvin illuminated it for the first time with the eyes of human observers present in the submersible, the experience was described as profound and moving and almost spiritual. The bow rose from the darkness, illuminated by the submersible's lights, showing details that could not be captured by the cameras of the Argo, showing the ship in a way that was both terrible and beautiful. The railings were clearly visible, the ship's structure was recognizable and intact. The anchors sat in their hawse holes ready to be dropped, waiting in frozen time for an order that would never come. The name of the ship was visible, the letters spelling out Titanic still readable on the hull, despite the layers of rust and sediment. To see the wreck in person, to be present at the same moment that human eyes were looking at it, to know that one was witnessing a moment of historical significance that would shape how the world understood the Titanic. All of this created an experience that Ballard and the other observers aboard Alvin described as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. The ocean floor at the wreck site was utterly still and silent and cold, a place that seemed to exist outside of normal time, that seemed to be frozen in a moment of profound quiet and peace. The Alvin's lights created small spheres of illumination against the absolute darkness of the abyss. The pressure outside the hull was immense and unforgiving. The temperature was barely above freezing. And yet, as the submersible moved through the water and the lights illuminated more and more of the wreck, there was a sense of beauty in the scene, a strange and haunting beauty that came from the perfect preservation and the alien quality of the place. The sense that one was witnessing something that had not been seen by human eyes for nearly 3/4 of a century, that had been preserved in this strange and distant place by forces that existed at the edge of human understanding. In the absolute darkness of the Atlantic Ocean, more than 2 miles below the surface, something profound is happening that few people pause to consider. The Titanic is not merely sitting on the ocean floor, preserved in some frozen moment of time. It is transforming. It is changing, very slowly, into something else entirely. And in that change lies a meditation on time itself, on the way the natural world reclaims what we build, on the patient work of the smallest creatures on Earth. The wreck descended into crushing darkness in 1912, and there it has remained for over a century, but never, not for a single moment, has it been untouched or unaltered. The bacteria are everywhere on the Titanic's hull. Everywhere. In 1991, 3 years after Robert Ballard first discovered the wreck, scientists descended into that darkness and came back with samples of strange, rust-coloured formations hanging from the ship's iron plates like frozen curtains or the skin of some ancient sleeping creature. These formations became known by the affectionate name rusticle, rust icicles, and they tell a story far more intricate and far more beautiful than simple corrosion. What scientists discovered was not merely the passive breakdown of metal, but an act of consumption, of appetite, of life itself feeding on the monument to human ambition. The rusticles are colonies of bacteria, thousands upon thousands of microscopic organisms working in perfect nameless coordination to break down the iron itself. They are eating the Titanic from the inside out, slowly, patiently, without hurry or malice, simply following the imperative written into their genetic code. This is not decay, this is transformation. The bacteria work in the thin layer of water between the rust and the ocean floor, in a specialized environment where oxygen is scarce and pressure is immense. They are called chemosynthetic bacteria because they derive their energy not from sunlight. Sunlight has never reached this place, but from chemical reactions, from the iron itself. In 1997, scientists identified a species of bacterium that was entirely new to science, a creature that had never been named or catalogued before, discovered on the wreck of the Titanic, feeding on the Titanic, living within the Titanic as surely as we live within our own skin. They named it Halomonas titanici, giving the bacteria the ship's own name, acknowledging the intimacy of their relationship, the strange partnership between wreck and organism. Somewhere in the Atlantic darkness right now, Halomonas titanicae is working, consuming the iron, transforming it, making the Titanic part of the ocean in a way that human engineers never anticipated. Scientists estimate that the Titanic as a recognizable structure will endure perhaps another 20 to 30 years. In the span of human memory, the ship will begin to collapse. The boilers that exploded with such violence in 1912 will finally give way. The grand staircase, that marvel of Edwardian engineering that passengers descended in their finest clothes, will crumble. The funnel that rose so high above the deck, painted in red and black and white, will topple. The hull plates will buckle and fold upon themselves, and gradually, grain by grain, molecule by molecule, the Titanic will return to the ocean. It will become part of the abyssal sediment, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, just another mound on the ocean floor. And yet there is something beautiful in this thought, something that can bring peace rather than despair. The Titanic is going home. It is returning to the element from which it came. The pressure at the depth where the Titanic rests, approximately 12,500 feet or 3,800 meters, is approximately 6,000 pounds per square inch. This is the kind of pressure that would crush a human body as easily as paper, that would collapse the chest cavity, that would crush the skull, that would annihilate consciousness in an instant. And yet the ocean at this depth is not violent. It is not turbulent. It is perfectly still. The water moves slowly, very slowly, in currents that take years to traverse vast distances. There is no sound. There is no light. There is only silence and stillness and the gentle work of bacteria and time. The submersibles that descend to the Titanic must be built from titanium, the strongest, most resilient metal known to human engineering. And even so, the engineers who design them work with exacting calculations, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could mean implosion. The pressure hulls of these submersibles are built to withstand forces that would tear apart steel, designed with redundancies and safety margins and the kind of meticulous care that comes only from absolute respect for the power of the ocean. The descent to the Titanic takes hours. A submersible might begin its journey at the surface, where humans can breathe, where light exists, where the world is familiar. Then it begins to sink and the light fades. The water grows darker. The temperature drops. The pressure increases with each meter, with each breath, with each moment of descent. The pilots must maintain perfect focus, must monitor the titanium hull, must listen for any sound that might suggest a problem. They cannot turn back instantly. The physics of buoyancy and pressure make a rapid ascent dangerous. The nitrogen in the pilot's blood must be expelled slowly, or the decompression sickness will kill them. So they descend slowly over hours, and the submersible becomes their entire world. There is nothing beyond the small viewport except darkness. There are only instruments and patience, and the knowledge that somewhere below, the Titanic waits. And then, slowly, the ship emerges from the darkness like a dream becoming solid, like memory becoming real. James Cameron, the filmmaker who brought the Titanic back into human consciousness through his 1997 film, descended to the wreck not once or twice but 33 times. 33 dives into that darkness, 33 journeys through the pressure, 33 encounters with the ship itself. More than anyone else in human history, more than any scientist, any explorer, any historian, Cameron spent time at the actual wreck. He saw the debris field spread across the abyssal plain. He saw the ship's bow, that impossible shape that had been hidden from human eyes for 85 years. He photographed it. He filmed it. He let it speak to him in the way that only direct encounter can allow. And those images, those authentic, real images of the actual Titanic, were woven into the opening and closing scenes of his film, so that audiences saw the real ship alongside the recreated one, saw the actual wreck in all its beauty and decay and mystery. In 2022, the most complete digital scan of the Titanic was completed, using advanced photogrammetry and three-dimensional mapping technology. Thousands of photographs were taken from every angle, from every possible perspective, and then combined using computational technology to create a perfect three-dimensional digital model of the entire wreck. The precision of this model is such that it is possible now to navigate through the virtual Titanic with a kind of intimacy that even the submersible pilots cannot achieve. It is possible to see into the swimming pool, to understand the layout of the cabins, to trace the path that a passenger might have walked. And this digital model has been made available to the world. Anyone with an internet connection can now visit the Titanic. Anyone can explore the wreck from their home, can spend as long as they wish examining every detail, can bring the ship from the depths of the ocean into their living room. The Titanic has become accessible in a way that physical exploration can never be, and in doing so it has reached more minds, more imaginations, more people seeking to understand what happened and why. In 2023, another submersible, a commercially operated vessel called the Titan, was lost to implosion while attempting to reach the Titanic. The vessel imploded in an instant, with all 5 people aboard killed. It was a reminder, painfully and tragically, of the absolute power of the ocean, of the way that pressure cares nothing for human intention, of the danger that lies in taking this environment lightly. The tragedy was an echo of what the Titanic itself learned more than a century ago, that the ocean will not be conquered, that human engineering, for all its sophistication and cleverness, exists at the mercy of forces far larger than itself. The Titan incident was not sensationalism or entertainment. It was a quiet reminder of the deep ocean's indifference to human life, a sobering knowledge that those who choose to descend must carry with them. The deep sea around the Titanic is an ecosystem unto itself, a world that receives no sunlight, that derives no energy from the sun, that exists in a state of equilibrium entirely foreign to the surface world. The bacteria feed on the chemicals and minerals that the wreck provides. The bacteria are fed upon by small creatures, amphipods and other arthropods that have adapted to this darkness, that have evolved to exist where no vertebrate could survive. These creatures in turn provide food for larger organisms. There is a food chain here, a web of life, built entirely on the foundation that the Titanic provides. The wreck has become an oasis on the abyssal plain, a place where life congregates because of the resources that the ship provides. When the Titanic finally collapses, when it finally surrenders to the pressure and time and the patient work of bacteria, the ecosystem that has grown around it will adapt and change. Life will find new resources, new partnerships, new ways of surviving. The deep ocean is patient. It is not cruel. It simply is what it is. And life, in its infinite cleverness and resilience, adapts. The titanium pressure hulls of submersibles are miracles of engineering, but they are also monuments to humility. They acknowledge that humans cannot simply engineer away the fundamental forces of the universe. The pilot sits in a sphere perhaps 2 meters in diameter, surrounded by walls thick enough to withstand the weight of the entire ocean, and yet it is still, fundamentally, a fragile bubble. The knowledge of this fragility, this dependence on the titanium sphere for survival, creates a peculiar kind of meditation. Submersible pilots describe the descent as meditative, not because it is peaceful, but because it demands complete presence. There is no room for distraction. There is no space for wandering thoughts. The mind must be here, now, in this moment, in this sphere, in this darkness. And perhaps this is why scientists continue to return to the Titanic, despite the danger, despite the cost. It is not merely the desire to understand history, it is also the profound meditation of being alive in a place where you understand, with absolute clarity, how fragile that life is. The debris field around the Titanic extends for miles in either direction. When the ship struck the iceberg and began to sink, it did not descend as the intact unit. It broke apart. The bow and stern separated and fell through the water independently, tumbling through the darkness, striking the ocean floor at different times and different locations. Objects floated out of the ship as it filled with water. Luggage, furniture, shoes, papers, all the artifacts of the lives that were being lived aboard when catastrophe struck. These objects drifted through the water column, some sinking quickly, some taking hours or days to reach the bottom, creating a trail, a map, a story written across the abyssal plain. When submersibles explore this debris field, they are not simply looking at the remains of a ship. They are looking at evidence of a human catastrophe, at the physical expression of loss, at the way that a moment of disaster radiates outward into space and time. The three-dimensional mapping of the Titanic that was completed in 2022 required an extraordinary commitment of resources and time. Teams of specialists descended to the wreck repeatedly, carrying cameras and sensors, taking thousands upon thousands of overlapping photographs. These photographs were then processed using artificial intelligence and sophisticated computational algorithms, each image analyzed, compared, registered against every other image until a perfect three-dimensional model emerged. This model is so precise that it reveals details that even the submersible pilots cannot see directly. The curvature of the ship's superstructure, the exact placement of every rivet, the subtle changes in the hull's surface where rust has formed. And this model, once created, has become a kind of gift to humanity. It is a gift that allows the Titanic to be studied without causing further damage. It is a gift that allows people who can never afford to take a submersible ride to still experience the wreck. It is a gift that preserves the Titanic in digital form, even as the physical ship slowly surrenders to time and pressure and the patient work of bacteria. The deep ocean is a place that seems, to human consciousness, to exist outside of time. It is so isolated, so removed from the rhythms of the surface world that it almost seems as though it exists in a permanent present, unchanged, unchanging, eternal. And yet this is an illusion. The deep ocean is alive with change. The bacteria are working. The rusticles are forming and growing. The hull is weakening. The structure is slowly, imperceptibly, but inexorably collapsing. Consider the nature of these rusticles more closely. These strange formations that hang from the Titanic's hull like forgotten ornaments, like the remnants of some elaborate festival that took place underwater and left these traces behind. The rusticles are mostly iron oxide, the products of corrosion, but they are not merely chemical products of oxidation. They are the physical embodiment of bacterial life. Inside each rusticle is a complex community of microorganisms, the Halomonas titanicae alongside other species, creating a three-dimensional city in miniature, a metropolis of microscopic life, all sustained by the iron that the Titanic provides. These creatures did not evolve to eat the Titanic. The Titanic arrived in their world, and they simply adapted, simply found a new food source, simply continued their ancient work of transforming compounds into energy and life. This is what makes the rusticles sacred in a way. Not sacred because the Titanic is sacred, but sacred because they represent life's infinite adaptability, life's refusal to despair, life's way of finding sustenance in even the most unexpected places. In another 30 years, perhaps less, the Titanic as we know it will no longer exist. The recognizable shape of the ship, the bow that rose so proudly above the water, the stern that pointed upward as the ship sank, these forms will be gone. The wreck will become a scatter of debris, a mound of corroded metal, a place where the history of human catastrophe lies so deep that it becomes invisible, becomes myth, becomes the kind of story that people tell to children without quite believing that it ever happened. But science will remember. The digital files, the three-dimensional models, the photographs and videos and data, these will persist, archived not in the fragile human mind, but in the vast databases and servers that store the sum total of human knowledge. Future generations will be able to explore the Titanic as it was, can compare the digital model from 2022 with newer models from future decades, can trace the decay, can understand the process of transformation that time has wrought. In this way, the Titanic achieves a kind of immortality. Even as the physical ship returns to the ocean, even as it disintegrates and dissolves, it will be preserved in the digital realm, in the space of pure information, accessible to anyone who seeks it. And yet, it did happen. Every night as you settle into sleep, as your breathing slows and your consciousness begins to drift, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, in absolute darkness, the bacteria continue their work. The rusticles continue to form, the Titanic continues to transform, and the ocean continues to keep its secrets, holding the ship in an embrace that will never let it go. If you're still awake and enjoying this, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep, when they need something to quiet their minds at 3 a.m, or when sleep seems impossible. Your subscription tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters, that there are people who want to spend their evenings in this space, the space between wakefulness and sleep, the space where history and meditation blend together. Now, back to the deep, back to the Titanic resting in its darkness, back to the slow, patient work of transformation that happens in the silence. The question of what should be done with the Titanic, whether it should be examined and artifacts recovered, or whether it should be left undisturbed and silent on the ocean floor, is not merely a scientific question or a legal one. It is a moral question, a question about how we treat the sites of human tragedy, about what we owe to the dead, about the boundary between understanding and exploitation. This question has created a profound divide among those who study the Titanic, a divide that touches something deep in human consciousness about respect and memory, and the proper place of the sacred in a world that often does not recognize the sacred at all. Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the Titanic in 1985, has consistently and forcefully argued that the wreck should be left alone, that it is a grave for more than 1,500 people, and that graves should not be disturbed. His position is one that comes from a place of respect, from an understanding that some sites are too sacred for exploration, even in the name of science and knowledge. And yet, from the moment the wreck was discovered, artifacts have been recovered. The company RMS Titanic Inc., which holds salvage rights to the wreck, has overseen the recovery of more than 5,500 artifacts from the debris field. More than 5,000 objects that once belonged to people, objects that these people touched, carried, treasured, used, have been brought back to the surface. Some of these artifacts are extraordinary. The ship's telegraph, the device that allowed communication between the bridge and the engine room, was recovered and restored. A section of the Titanic's hull measuring 15 meters in length and weighing more than 2,000 tons, known colloquially as the Big Piece, was raised from the ocean floor in 1998 in an extraordinary feat of engineering and determination. Sections of the ship's railing, plates from the dining rooms, chandeliers that once hung in the corridors where passengers strolled in their finest evening clothes, all of these have been brought to the surface, documented, preserved, and displayed in museums and travelling exhibitions around the world. To understand the debate, it helps to understand the artefacts themselves. What are these objects that have been recovered? They are testimony. A pocket watch, recovered from the debris, stopped at 2:28 in the morning, the moment the ship's power failed, the moment the lights went out. A perfume vial, sealed, still fragrant after more than a century of salt water, recovered intact from a cabin. A leather suitcase containing letters and photographs, the life story of a passenger preserved in ink and image. A child's leather shoe, barely larger than a doll's shoe. China plates from the first-class dining room, with their elegant patterns still visible beneath the patina of age. These are not mere objects. These are evidence of lives. These are the physical remnants of a moment frozen in time, the moment before tragedy, the moment of human activity, the moment when people were still alive, still thinking their thoughts, still pursuing their purposes, still unaware that this would be the last moment of their existence. Some of these artifacts tell stories of extraordinary ordinary lives. The letters recovered from the debris speak to family members who would never receive them, to business dealings that would never be completed, to love and anxiety and hope expressed in the only form available, handwriting, ink on paper. Some artifacts speak to the class divide that was so stark on the Titanic. First-class passengers carried fine luggage and expensive clothing. Steerage passengers carried what they could, often just one small bag containing everything they owned, everything they hoped to build a new life with in America. The artifacts that have been recovered preserve this divide, preserve the evidence of who survived and who did not, preserve the material evidence of the injustice that the sinking wrought. The salvage operation that brought up the big piece in 1998 was a decision point in the debate over the Titanic. Raising a 15-ton section of hull required special equipment, required ships on the surface, required coordination and planning and enormous expense. It was not a casual decision. It was an intentional act of retrieval, an assertion that the artifact was valuable enough to remove from its resting place. The big piece now lives in museums, displayed to the public, allowing people to see the actual hull of the ship, to understand its construction, to comprehend in a tangible way something about the engineering and construction that created the Titanic. But in retrieving the big piece, in bringing it to the surface, salvage teams also altered the wreck. They removed a section of the ship's structure, they changed the site, they asserted that the knowledge gained was worth the act of alteration. Robert Ballard's position, that the site should be treated as a grave and left undisturbed, comes from a deep well of respect. He has argued that the Titanic's resting place should be treated with the same reverence and protection that we offer to cemeteries and battlefields on land. This position is not irrational. It is not merely sentimental. It comes from a recognition that some places are sacred because of what happened there, that some places deserve to be left alone, that some knowledge is not worth the price of violation. There is profound wisdom in Ballard's position, wisdom that recognizes that mere preservation is not the only or highest value, that sometimes letting something rest is the most respectful thing we can do. And yet the other position, that we can learn from the artifacts, that we can preserve history by recovering and studying these objects, also has merit. The artifacts tell stories that might otherwise be lost. The letters, the photographs, the personal objects all carry information about the people who died in the Titanic disaster, about their lives, their hopes, their connections to others. By recovering and preserving these objects, we can keep their memory alive. We can understand what happened more deeply. We can learn lessons about safety and design that have saved lives since. The debate, perhaps, cannot be fully resolved, because it touches on fundamental questions about how we relate to history, about what we owe to the dead, about the proper boundaries between knowledge and respect. In 2012, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, passed a convention on the protection of underwater cultural heritage. This convention extended legal protections to the Titanic, recognizing it as a site of historical and cultural significance. The convention established principles for how the wreck should be treated, how future exploration should be conducted, and what kinds of artifacts, if any, could be removed. These legal protections represent an acknowledgement that the Titanic is not merely a commercial salvage opportunity, not merely a place where artifacts can be extracted for profit. It is a place of historical importance, a place of cultural significance, a place that belongs to all of humanity, not just to those with the resources to reach it. Museums around the world now display artifacts from the Titanic. In Liverpool, in Belfast, in New York, in other cities across the globe, visitors can see the actual objects that were recovered from the wreck. These exhibitions are often profound experiences. People stand before a piece of the Titanic's hull and feel a connection to history. They read the stories of passengers, look at their belongings, contemplate the human lives that were lived and lost. Children who have seen the James Cameron film come to these museums and suddenly the movie becomes real. The objects they saw in the film are there, solid, tangible, actually present. The film opened with scenes of the real wreck, and the museums continue that work of making the Titanic real, of bringing it from the depths of historical memory into the space of direct human experience. The legal question of who owns the Titanic has been complex and contested. The ship sank in international waters, belonged to a British company, was found by an American explorer and has been salvaged by a company incorporated in the United States. Multiple nations have argued for claim rights. The Republic of Ireland has asserted claims based on the Irish passengers aboard. The United Kingdom has asserted claims based on the ship's registration. France has been involved because portions of the wreck lie within French territorial waters. These legal battles represent something profound about human nature. Our desire to possess, to control, to claim ownership of even the most tragic and sacred sites. The UNESCO Convention helps to provide a framework for how these claims should be balanced, how the wreck can be protected even if no single nation can claim absolute ownership. The stories embedded in the recovered artifacts are deeply human and deeply moving. A pocket watch that stopped at 2:28 is more than a technological object. It is time arrested. It is the last moment of someone's life made tangible. A perfume vial is not merely a bottle of fragrance. It is a small luxury, a moment of feminine dignity, perhaps a woman preparing herself for a special occasion before the disaster struck. A leather suitcase filled with letters is not merely paper and ink. It is the voice of someone who is no longer alive, the expression of thoughts and feelings and hopes that will never be fulfilled. These artifacts are bridges between the living and the dead. They allow us to know the people who perished, to understand that they were not merely statistics, not merely names on a list, but individual humans with interior lives, with hopes and fears and relationships and purposes. Consider the recovered dishes from the Titanic's first-class dining room. Elegant porcelain with delicate patterns, unmarked by time and salt water. These dishes are evidence of the aspirations of the ship's owners and designers. They wanted to create something beautiful, something that would convey refinement and elegance, and the idea that the ship itself was a floating palace. The passengers who ate from these dishes were dining in style, were being offered fine cuisine in elegant surroundings, were experiencing the pinnacle of luxury travel. And yet within hours of sailing, this luxury became irrelevant. The elegance of the dishes meant nothing when the ship struck the ice. The beauty and refinement that the dishes represented could not save the people who ate from them. And now, more than a century later, the dishes survive while those people do not. The dishes are artifacts of innocence, of a moment before disaster, of human attempts to create beauty and refinement in the face of an indifferent universe. The first-class passengers who boarded the Titanic were among the wealthiest people in the world. They brought trunks filled with clothes and jewellery and personal effects. Their artifacts reflect lives of luxury and privilege. The third-class passengers, by contrast, brought what they could carry. Their artifacts reflect hope and poverty and determination. Many of them were immigrants travelling to America to start new lives. Their possessions reflect the fact that they were people of modest means, who had saved money for passage, who had risked everything on the hope that they could find better lives in the new world. When we see the artifacts side by side, the fine luggage of the wealthy alongside the simple bags of the poor, we see the Titanic's tragedy in material form. We see that class determined who lived and who died. We see the physical evidence of injustice. Imagine the thoughts of a third-class passenger, someone who boarded with a single suitcase containing everything. Perhaps clothing carefully packed, perhaps photographs of family members left behind, perhaps documents and certificates that would be needed to establish a new identity in a new country. This person travelled in a separate section of the ship, was given inferior accommodations, had less access to the lifeboats when the disaster struck. The statistics bear this out. Only about 25% of third-class passengers survived, compared to about 60% of first-class passengers. The artifacts of first-class passengers are more numerous, more carefully preserved, more prominent in exhibitions, simply because first-class passengers were more likely to have possessions that survived and more likely to have been in locations where artifacts could be recovered. The imbalance in the recovered artifacts mirrors the imbalance that existed aboard the ship, that was expressed in the disaster, that continues to shape how we remember and understand the Titanic. The controversy over artifact recovery remains unresolved, and perhaps it should remain unresolved. Perhaps the debate itself, the tension between those who wish to recover and those who wish to preserve, represents a healthy wrestling with the question of how we should treat our heritage, how we should honour our dead, how we should balance knowledge with respect. The Titanic forces us to ask these questions in a way that few other sites do. It forces us to think about whether every wreck should be explored, whether every artifact should be recovered, whether there are places on Earth that should remain undisturbed, sanctuaries of silence and rest on the bottom of the ocean. The passenger lists from the Titanic preserve names and ages and nationalities and sometimes occupations, the material facts of people's identities, but it is the recovered artifacts that give texture and substance to those names. A child's shoe tells us that a child was aboard. A letter tells us what that person was thinking, what they cared about, what they anticipated for the future. A piece of jewellery tells us that someone had valued beauty enough to bring it with them on their journey. These artifacts transform the passenger list from abstract data into something personal, something human, something that touches the living because it carries the presence of the dead. In this sense, the recovered artifacts are acts of memorial, ways of ensuring that the people who died are remembered not as statistics, but as individuals with lives and hopes and loves and fears. The travelling exhibitions that display Titanic artifacts move from city to city, and in each city they draw enormous crowds. People line up to see the artifacts, to stand before the physical remnants of the disaster, to contemplate what happened more than a century ago. These exhibitions are pilgrimages in a modern sense, people travelling to witness something sacred, something that speaks to fundamental human questions about mortality and loss and the fragility of human accomplishment. The exhibitions transform the Titanic from a historical abstraction into something tangible and real, something that you can see with your own eyes and touch with your own hands, or at least see others touch through protective glass. This connection is valuable. It deepens understanding in ways that reading about history cannot quite achieve. The debate over salvage rights and artifact recovery also touches on questions of economic justice. The salvage company that recovered artifacts has invested enormous resources in the operations. Submersible dives cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Ships must be chartered. Equipment must be maintained and repaired. The company has argued that it deserves compensation for these costs, that artifacts should be sold, or that exhibitions should generate revenue that can be used to fund future research and preservation. But others argue that the Titanic, as a grave site and a cultural heritage site, should not be treated as a commodity, should not be the occasion for profit. This tension between commercial interests and cultural protection continues to generate debate and, occasionally, litigation. The UNESCO Convention represents an attempt to resolve this tension by establishing principles that prioritise protection and preservation while acknowledging the legitimate interests of those who conduct research and exploration. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight, someone struggling with sleep, someone seeking history and peace, and the kind of slow, thoughtful exploration that prepares the mind for rest. Someone for whom the world moves too fast and who craves this kind of measured, meditative pace. Your share tells them that there is a place on the internet where they can come to slow down, to think deeply, to connect with history in a way that soothes rather than agitates. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Each new subscriber tells me that this work matters, that there are people who want to spend their evenings in this space, that history and meditation can blend together into something that serves the human need for rest and understanding and connection to something larger than ourselves. No shipwreck in human history has captured the imagination as persistently and as powerfully as the Titanic. This is remarkable when you consider that there have been many maritime disasters. Ships have sunk in far greater numbers, have taken far more lives, have resulted in tragedies of extraordinary magnitude. The Lusitania, torpedoed by a German U-boat during the First World War, killed nearly 1,200 people in 18 minutes. The Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship, was wrecked on a reef in the Mediterranean Sea. The Edmund Fitzgerald, a freighter on the Great Lakes, sank in a storm in 1975, with all 29 crew members lost. There have been maritime disasters throughout human history in every ocean in every era, and yet none of these shipwrecks has achieved the cultural resonance, the imaginative grip, the almost mythological status of the Titanic. Why? What is it about this particular ship, this particular disaster, that has made it such an enduring presence in human consciousness? The answer is not simple. It involves elements of history, symbolism, human drama, technology, and something less tangible. A kind of cultural resonance that the Titanic has achieved that few other historical events have managed. The Titanic speaks to us across more than a century, with a voice that remains fresh, that remains relevant, that continues to teach lessons about human nature and human limitation. Part of the answer lies in the symbolic weight that the Titanic carries. The ship was advertised, with tremendous confidence and not a small amount of hubris, as unsinkable. It was the largest ship in the world when it was launched. It represented the pinnacle of human engineering, the very best that human intelligence and human industry could produce. It carried the wealthy and famous, captains of industry, members of the aristocracy, people of such prominence that their names are still known more than a century after their deaths. And yet the unsinkable ship sank. It sank on its maiden voyage, before it had even completed the crossing for which it was designed. The disaster therefore became, in the human imagination, a story about human hubris, about the way that human beings overestimate their own power, overestimate their ability to control and conquer nature. It became a story about the limitations of human engineering, about the way that the ocean, indifferent, powerful, ancient, remains ultimately beyond human domination. The sinking of the Titanic happened at a particular moment in human history, at a moment when belief in progress and technology was at its highest, when people were increasingly confident that human beings could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, achieve any goal through the application of intelligence and industrial capacity. The Titanic disaster contradicted this confidence. It suggested that there were limits, that nature remained fundamentally beyond human control, that tragedy could strike even, or perhaps especially, in the midst of the greatest achievements. This uncertainty, this challenge to the narrative of inevitable progress, is part of what made the Titanic so culturally significant. It forced people to confront the gap between human aspiration and human limitation. And then there is the human element, the extraordinary class divisions that existed aboard the ship, and the way that these divisions were expressed in the disaster. The first-class passengers, the wealthiest people in the world, were given priority access to the lifeboats. The third-class passengers, immigrants travelling to America, were kept in the lower decks, were given less information about the extent of the danger, were less likely to escape. The survival rates tell this story with devastating clarity. Approximately 62% of first-class passengers survived, while only about 25% of third-class passengers survived. The women and children were given priority in the lifeboats. Women and children first was the principle. But even this principle was applied differently for first-class and third-class passengers. The disaster therefore became, in human consciousness, a story about injustice, about the way that wealth and social status determined who lived and who died. It became a story about the human failures that led to more lifeboats not being carried aboard, a human choice driven by aesthetic concerns and the desire for uncluttered decks. And then there were the musicians, the band that continued to play as the ship sank. Wallace Hartley was the bandmaster, a musician from Lancashire in England. He was joined by 7 other musicians, each of them also skilled, all of them members of the ship's orchestra. As the Titanic sank, as water flooded the compartments, as people struggled in the darkness to find lifeboats and escape, the band continued to play. They played as the ship filled with water. They played as the ship's bow descended into the darkness. They played as the ship's stern rose higher and higher into the air. They played through the moments of greatest chaos and terror. According to survivors, they played a hymn. There is dispute about which hymn, whether it was Nearer My God to Thee or another. And they continued playing until the very moment of the ship's final break and collapse. The musicians did not survive. They went down with the ship, but their courage, their commitment to their craft even in the face of death, became one of the enduring symbols of the Titanic disaster, a symbol of grace in the face of tragedy, of the power of art and music to remain steadfast even when everything else falls apart. The James Cameron film, released in 1997, transformed the Titanic from a historical fact into a cultural phenomenon. The film was extraordinary in scope and ambition. It cost approximately $200 million to produce, an extraordinary sum at that time. It featured state-of-the-art special effects. It told a love story against the backdrop of the historical disaster. It was, in many ways, a film for the modern era. It used contemporary filmmaking techniques. It told stories through emotion and personal connection, rather than through historical exposition. It appealed to younger audiences who might not otherwise be interested in historical events. The film was enormously successful. It became one of the highest-grossing films of all time. It was watched by billions of people around the world. It introduced the Titanic to a new generation, made the disaster real and immediate in a way that historical accounts could never quite do. And the film did something remarkable. It opened with actual footage of the real Titanic wreck. The first images that audiences saw were not recreations or artistic interpretations, but actual photographs of the wreck, filmed by submersible, showing the bow of the ship as it actually exists on the ocean floor. For the first time, most people who were interested in the Titanic could see what the actual wreck looked like. The film later returned to these images in the closing scenes, showing the real wreck as it was in its degraded state on the bottom of the ocean. This was a powerful artistic choice. It acknowledged the reality of the wreck even as the film told a fictional story. It suggested that the historical Titanic and the film's Titanic were connected, were part of the same narrative. The actual wreck became tangible, became visible, became part of the cultural conversation about the ship. The Titanic disaster led directly to changes in maritime law and maritime safety. After the disaster, the International Ice Patrol was established, an organisation dedicated to detecting and tracking icebergs and warning ships of their presence. The regulations required that ships carry lifeboats for all passengers and crew. The Titanic had carried lifeboats for only about 1,400 people, when it carried a total of about 2,200. The regulations also required that ships maintain a 24-hour radio watch, ensuring that distress signals would be heard and that other ships could respond to emergencies. These regulations, born from tragedy, have saved countless lives in the decades since the Titanic sank. Every time a ship receives a warning about icebergs ahead, every time a lifeboat drill ensures that passengers know the evacuation procedures, every time a radio operator stands watch through the night, the legacy of the Titanic is present. The disaster, terrible as it was, led to improvements that have prevented other disasters. This is part of what makes the Titanic enduring. It is not merely a story about what went wrong, but also a story about how humans learned from tragedy, how we responded to disaster by making the world safer. Consider the other great maritime disasters in comparative perspective. The Lusitania sank because of wartime actions, a torpedo fired by a military vessel in the context of a war. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank in a storm, a natural disaster, a collision between human technology and natural forces that the technology was not adequate to resist. These were tragedies, but they did not carry the same kind of symbolic weight as the Titanic, because they did not challenge human confidence in the same way. The Titanic sank because of a conjunction of human error and natural circumstance. The ship was travelling too fast through an ice field. There were no adequate warnings. There were insufficient lifeboats. The nearby ship Californian did not respond to distress signals. Each of these was a human choice, a human failure, a moment where things could have been different. This is what makes the Titanic so culturally significant. It suggests that the disaster was not inevitable, that it was preventable, that it happened because of human choices and human limitations. The enduring grip of the Titanic on human imagination also relates to its status as a tomb, as a grave containing the remains of more than 1,500 human beings. The wreck is not merely a historical artifact or a site of interest. It is a place where people died, where their remains rest, where their presence can still be felt. To descend to the Titanic is to visit a grave, to commune with the dead, to acknowledge the reality of human mortality in a way that is difficult to escape when you are surrounded by the physical evidence of death. The deep ocean, dark and silent and unchanging, becomes a kind of cosmic cemetery, a place where the dead rest in a peace that is beyond human disturbance, in a stillness that the living can only glimpse. This sacred dimension of the Titanic, its status as a grave, a tomb, a place where death rests, adds a kind of spiritual weight to it that other shipwrecks may not carry. The Titanic has become, in the human imagination, a place where mortality itself rests, where we can contemplate the end of all things without the distraction of the living world's noise and demands. It is, in a sense, a kind of memento mori, a reminder of death that helps us to understand the value of life, that helps us to put aside the trivial concerns of daily existence and to focus on what truly matters. To think about the Titanic is to think about death, about loss, about the fragility of human accomplishment, about the certainty of mortality that applies to all of us, regardless of our wealth or status or position in society. The Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship, met her own tragic end when she struck a mine in the Mediterranean Sea during the First World War. The ship sank, but in daylight and in calmer circumstances than the Titanic, and a greater percentage of the crew and passengers survived. The disaster is far less well known than the Titanic, even though it was a significant maritime tragedy. The difference is that the Britannic sank during wartime, in the context of a military conflict, and the sinking seems to fit into the larger narrative of the war's devastation. It is seen as part of history, part of the chronology of a larger event. The Titanic, by contrast, sank in a moment of peace. It sank not because of warfare or military conflict, but because of the conjunction of natural circumstances and human error. This isolation from larger historical events, paradoxically, made the Titanic's sinking seem even more meaningful, even more laden with significance. It forced people to confront the disaster in its own terms, without the ability to fit it into a larger explanatory framework. The continuing cultural presence of the Titanic in the modern world is remarkable. More than a century after the sinking, the ship remains an object of fascination, an occasion for films and books and exhibits and popular culture references. Why does this continue? What is it about the Titanic that prevents it from fading into historical obscurity, that keeps it alive and present in human consciousness? Part of the answer surely relates to the universal human themes that the Titanic embodies, the theme of tragedy striking the celebrated and the famous, the theme of human limitations revealed by encounter with nature, the theme of social injustice and class division, the theme of grace and courage in the face of death. These are eternal themes in human culture. They appear in ancient literature, in religious texts, in folk tales and stories that have been passed down through generations. The Titanic is, in a sense, a modern expression of these eternal human themes. It tells stories about human nature that are timeless, that speak to fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. And then there is the technology of memory itself. The Titanic sank before the widespread use of motion pictures, but there is extensive photographic documentation of the ship before it sank. There are written accounts by survivors. There are ship's records and passenger lists and manifests. The disaster has been preserved in these documents and records, has been kept alive by historians and researchers and writers who have continued to study it and write about it. And in recent decades, the technology of exploration has made it possible to physically visit the wreck, to see the actual ship as it rests on the ocean floor. This has made the Titanic tangible in new ways, has turned it from an historical abstraction into something that can be seen and experienced directly. The digital mapping of the wreck, the virtual exploration that is now possible, represents a kind of ultimate preservation. The ship is preserved not only in documents and in memory, but in three-dimensional digital form, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The Titanic endures because it is a story about human beings, about their hopes and fears, their capacity for courage and grace, their vulnerability to loss and tragedy. The statistics about survival rates matter, but what matters more are the stories of individual people. It matters that the musicians continued to play. It matters that first-class passengers gave their places in lifeboats to people they did not know. It matters that third-class passengers fought desperately for survival in circumstances that were unfairly stacked against them. It matters that there were acts of kindness and acts of selfishness, moments of cowardice and moments of bravery, expressions of the full range of human emotion and human behaviour. The Titanic disaster is, in this sense, a kind of human crucible. It reveals human nature in all of its complexity, all of its contradiction, all of its capacity for both failure and nobility. Every person aboard the Titanic was travelling toward a future. Every person had made decisions that led to that moment, made choices about whether to board the ship, had hopes and plans and expectations about what would happen next. And then the future stopped. The future was replaced by a present that was nothing like what anyone had anticipated. This violent interruption of the future, this sudden collapse of expectation into reality, is part of what makes the Titanic so enduringly tragic and so culturally powerful. It speaks to the fragility of human plans, the unpredictability of life, the way that circumstances beyond our control can alter everything in an instant. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight. Tell them about this space, about what it means to spend time with history in a way that is meditative and thoughtful rather than sensational. Tell them that there is a place on YouTube where they can come to slow down, where they can think deeply about human events and human nature without being overwhelmed by noise and haste. Tell them that history, approached with the right spirit, can be deeply calming, can help prepare the mind for sleep, can offer a kind of philosophical preparation for the rest that sleep requires. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I upload every day, and there's always something new to drift off to, whether it is history, science, philosophy, nature, or any of the countless subjects that benefit from the kind of slow, meditative approach that this channel brings to them. Have you ever seen Titanic artifacts in person? If you have, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What artifact moved you most deeply? What story did it tell about the people who were aboard the ship? The Titanic rests in the darkness, more than 2 miles below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It has been there for 112 years, resting in a quiet so profound that human consciousness struggles to comprehend it. In another 20 or 30 years, it will begin to collapse in earnest. The bacteria will continue their patient work, breaking down iron into rust, into oxides, into substances that will gradually disperse into the water around the wreck. The rust will deepen, the hull will weaken. The recognizable shape of the ship, the bow that is so distinctive, so iconic, so emblematic of the Titanic, the stern that pointed upward as the ship sank, the superstructure with its funnels and masts and the fixtures that once held electric lights. All of these will gradually give way. The ship will collapse inward, will crumble, will scatter across the abyssal plain like leaves falling in a silent forest. The Titanic will transform, and in that transformation there is something beautiful, something that need not be approached with despair. The ship is not being destroyed, not in any ultimate sense. It is being transformed. It is changing from one state into another. It is returning to the elements from which it came, to the iron that was mined from the earth deep below the surface, to the ocean that now holds it, to the bacteria that will consume it and make it part of the living world in a new way. The ship will become part of the ecosystem of the abyssal plain. It will become food for creatures, shelter for animals, a source of minerals and nutrients. What humans built will eventually feed the life that exists in the deep ocean, will become woven into the fabric of that ecosystem, will contribute to the survival and thriving of organisms that have never seen sunlight, that have never known anything except the absolute darkness and cold of the deep. Consider what will remain when the structure has collapsed. Bronze does not corrode easily. The Titanic's bronze propellers, massive sculptures of metal, each one weighing several tons, will persist far longer than the iron hull. They will rest on the abyssal plain, silent and immobile, long after the ship itself has disintegrated. The ceramic tiles that line the ship's passages will persist. The glass fixtures, the brass hardware, the materials that humans selected for their resistance to corrosion and time, these will endure. 1,000 years from now, if a submersible were somehow able to return to this site, it would find these artifacts, would find traces of human habitation in the form of objects designed to last. But the ship itself, the structure that held these objects, will be gone. It will have returned to the ocean. Imagine the Titanic site 500 years in the future. What will it look like? The abyssal plain is not unchanging despite its apparent stillness. Sediment drifts down from above, accumulates slowly, gradually covers the wreck. In 500 years, the Titanic will be largely buried. There will be a gentle mound on the ocean floor, perhaps, a slight elevation in the terrain that indicates that something unusual is there. The greatest ships, the most impressive human accomplishments, the works of engineering and industry that seem so permanent, so solid, so enduring. They too will eventually become invisible, will be covered by this slow accumulation of sediment, will become part of the ocean floor itself. This is not tragedy. This is the way of all things. This is the manner in which the earth reclaims what humans have built, the way that the natural world continues its patient, endless work of transformation and renewal. The deep ocean is a place of absolute stillness. There is no wind in the deep ocean because wind requires air, and there is no air 12,000 feet below the surface. There are no waves because waves are a phenomenon of the surface, created by the interaction of wind and water and light. In the deep ocean, there is only the slow movement of currents, the gentle circulation of water that might take years to move a great distance. There is no sound in the way that we know sound on the surface. There might be the creaking of the ship's metal as it settles, the rare sound of a creature moving through the water, but these are so few, so infrequent, that the predominant experience of the deep ocean is silence. It is an absolute silence, a silence so complete that it almost seems not to be silence at all, but rather the absence of even the concept of sound. To descend into this silence is to leave behind all the noise of the living world, the traffic and voices and machinery and music and speech that fill the surface world, that fill our days with demands and distractions. In the deep ocean, there is only quiet, and this quiet is profound. It is not the quiet of a library or a meditation room where there is some sound, some ambient noise, some consciousness of the possibility of sound. This is the quiet of absolute absence, and in that absence the mind finds a kind of peace that is difficult to access in the world above. And this quiet is restful. The human mind, when it encounters such complete stillness and silence, often experiences a kind of peace. The aggressive, demanding, competitive nature of surface consciousness can relax. The need to constantly monitor and evaluate and respond to stimuli can release. What remains is a kind of simplicity, a kind of basic awareness of being alive, of existing in a space and time, of participating in the vast impersonal processes of the natural world. This is similar to what the mind experiences in sleep. In sleep, the cacophony of consciousness quiets. The mind releases its grip on the urgent and the immediate. Awareness drifts into a state that is difficult to describe but recognizable to anyone who has experienced it. A state that is both peaceful and alert, both conscious and unconscious, both present and absent. The deep ocean is, in a certain sense, a place of sleep. It is a place of deep rest, of stillness, of surrender to forces larger than any individual will. Just as the body needs sleep to restore itself, to repair the damage of the day, to consolidate memory and learning, so too does consciousness benefit from encountering silence and stillness. The deep ocean offers this to the Titanic, offers this to any creature that inhabits those dark spaces. And now you are beginning to experience something similar. Your breathing is slowing, your heartbeat is steadying, your awareness is beginning to drift away from the concerns of the waking world. You are falling into that oceanic consciousness, that state of deep stillness that is so similar to what the deep ocean itself embodies. The Titanic rests in this place of sleep. The ship has been resting for more than a century, and it will continue to rest, gradually transforming, gradually returning to the elements, gradually becoming one with the ocean that holds it. And as we contemplate this slow transformation, as we sit with these images in our minds, the ship descending through the water, the bacteria working patiently on the hull, the future collapse that will scatter the ship across the abyssal plain, we can find in this meditation a kind of companion to our own rest. Just as the Titanic has found its peace in the darkness of the ocean, so too can we find our peace in the darkness of sleep, in the quiet hours when consciousness retreats and the body is allowed to rest. Sleep is a kind of dying, a temporary surrender of consciousness, a release into a state that resembles the ocean's darkness, and yet we emerge from sleep renewed, reborn, ready to engage with the world again. The Titanic will never emerge. The ship will never come back to the surface. It will remain in its grave, in its tomb of water and darkness, for as long as the ocean exists. But in its rest, in its gradual dissolution, in its slow transformation, the Titanic finds a kind of peace that nothing in the surface world can offer. The ship is beyond reach. It is beyond human disturbance, or it will be eventually as it becomes increasingly difficult to access, increasingly buried, increasingly remote. The ship is released from the burdens of memory, from the demands of commemoration, from the expectations of the living. It rests. It rests in silence and darkness and absolute peace. And we, in our own small way, can honour that rest by recognising the value of rest itself, by understanding that the end of activity is not a failure, but an achievement, that the quiet conclusion of life has a dignity all its own. The water at the Titanic's depth is cold, just a few degrees above freezing, cold enough that human skin exposed to it would lose consciousness within minutes. The temperature is constant. There is no day and no night in the deep ocean, no seasons changing, no variation in climate or weather. It is always the same, dark, cold, still, silent. This constancy has a meditative quality to it. In a world of change and flux and uncertainty, the deep ocean represents something absolute, something that does not vary, something that can be counted on to be the same today as it was 100 years ago and as it will be 100 years in the future. The ocean's temperature did not change on the day the Titanic sank. The water did not respond to the tragedy. The ocean continued to be what it is, indifferent, ancient, eternal. There is something deeply restful about this thought. In contemplating the Titanic resting in this unchanging world, we can find our own rest, our own peace, our own surrender to forces beyond our control and beyond our need to control. Just as the Titanic cannot resist the ocean, cannot change the temperature or pressure or darkness of the place where it rests, so too can we release our need to control everything, can acknowledge that some things are beyond our power, can find peace in that acknowledgement. Imagine yourself there, in the darkness, at the Titanic's depth. Imagine the absolute quiet. Imagine the water surrounding you, pressing down with its immense weight, holding you, cradling you, keeping you safe in its cold embrace. Imagine the absence of light, the absence of sound, the absence of the stimuli that keep consciousness active and engaged. Imagine the slow process of dissolution and transformation happening around you, the bacteria working, the metal rusting, the ship gradually settling into the sediment. Imagine being released from the need to do anything, to achieve anything, to become anything. Imagine simply being, existing in a state of perfect rest and peace. This is the kind of consciousness that sleep offers, the kind of peace that awaits when you release your grip on the day, when you stop striving and struggling and simply allow yourself to fall. The Titanic has been falling into this peace for more than a century, and perhaps in contemplating its fall, in sitting with the image of the ship resting in its ocean grave, we can find permission to fall as well, to release our own burdens, to surrender to the rest that our bodies demand. Your body knows what it needs. Your body's already beginning to rest, already beginning to release the tension of the day. Let it happen. Don't resist. Don't struggle. Simply allow the rest to come to you, the way water comes to fill a vessel, the way darkness comes with the setting of the sun, the way sleep comes to those who surrender to it. The stars are above the ocean, invisible from the surface because of the lights of human civilization, but real nonetheless. If you were standing on the water above the Titanic right now, if you were in a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic at night, far from any lights or cities, you would see the stars. They would be clear and bright in the darkness. They would shine down on the water, and the water would reflect the light, and the whole world would seem to be made of light and darkness and the space between them. But beneath your boat, beneath the waves, beneath the light of the stars, beneath all of this, the Titanic rests in a darkness so complete that it is beyond the understanding of anyone who has never experienced it. The stars are 12,000 feet away, separated from the wreck not by distance, in any ordinary sense, but by the weight of the entire ocean. And yet the Titanic is part of the same universe as the stars. It is subject to the same laws of physics, the same laws of thermodynamics, the same laws of time and change and decay. The ship is as much a part of the cosmos as any star, as any galaxy, as any celestial body spinning through the void. And you too are part of this cosmos. You are subject to the same laws. You are made of the same elements that make up the stars, that make up the ocean, that make up the iron of the Titanic. Everything is connected. Everything is part of everything else. And in sleep, in the deep rest that sleep provides, you return to this connection, this unity, this sense of being part of something vast and impersonal, and ultimately comforting. You are drifting now. Your eyes are heavy. Your breathing is slowing. Your consciousness is beginning to separate from the urgencies of the day, to release its grip on the things that demanded your attention. Let yourself fall. Let yourself descend through the darkness just as the Titanic descended through the water column more than a century ago. Let yourself release the weight of the day. Let yourself surrender to the slow current that will carry you towards sleep. Feel the weight of your blanket on your body. Feel the warmth beneath the covers. This weight, this warmth. These are the physical expressions of safety, of being held, of being protected in the darkness. The Titanic rests in its darkness, at peace, transformed, slowly becoming part of the ocean and the ocean floor. And you too can rest. You too can find the peace that comes from surrender, from release, from allowing yourself to drift into the quiet where restoration happens. The ocean keeps its secrets. The deep water holds the ship in its embrace. and sleep holds you in its embrace as well. The Titanic's bow emerges slightly from the sediment, a monument to human ambition and human failure, a testament to the power of nature and the fragility of human accomplishment. But it is also, simply, a ship resting on the ocean floor, at peace, no longer burdened by the expectations of the living, no longer caught in the urgency and struggle of the surface world. The ship has earned its rest. It sank more than a century ago, and in the years since it has done nothing except rest. The ship has no more work to do. It has no destination to reach. It exists now only in the present moment, in the cool darkness, in the patient, slow transformation that time brings. Let yourself rest as the ship rests. Let yourself be held by the darkness and the quiet and the stillness. Let your mind soften. Let your body relax. Feel the warmth of your blankets. Feel the comfort of your pillow. These physical anchors of rest are more real than any worry or concern of the day. Let yourself fall into sleep the way the Titanic fell into the ocean, and know that you will wake renewed in the morning, like the dawn breaking over the Atlantic, like the slow turning of the earth bringing light back to the world. This is the rhythm of existence, waking and sleeping, work and rest, effort and surrender. The Titanic has found its place in this rhythm, has found its rest. The Titanic will continue to rest. The bacteria will continue their work. The ocean will continue to hold what it holds, and you will wake to another day, another journey, another opportunity to move through the world. But for now, for this moment, for these hours of darkness, let sleep be your ocean. Let it hold you. Let it give you the rest that only sleep can provide. Sleep now. Rest. The ship rests, and you are resting with it, in the warm darkness, in the quiet of the deep.